Indian Research Scholars 11th webinar. We are back once again with a topic that is relevant, especially for international relations scholars. And it is no wonder that it seems to be quite popular and an emerging topic. We are glad that you have all joined us for an in-depth analysis and insights by Paul Szymanski. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Ariba Ahsanat Mausam, Senior Research Scholar at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. I would now like to request one of our executive members from Shillong, Evangeline Nonclaw, who is a PhD research scholar at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, to walk us through the progress of Association of Indian Research Scholars. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Ariba. Hi, I'm Evangeline, and I'm going to be reading you the progress of AIRS. The Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS, is the brainchild of the President Ariba Ahsanat Muazzam. It was created to bring together like-minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation. It aims to collectively increase the knowledge base through interaction with the best minds in the world. So far, in the past 1.5 months, we have been able to have passionate discussions with Professor Muazzam Ali, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Rajan Harshe, Professor Arun Padnaik, Professor Alfredo Toro Hodi, among others. The aim of this association has been to provide a platform for young scholars to connect with experts where they can have stimulating and interactive sessions with them. We have not only brought on the greats on our platform, but have also managed to start the Young Scholar Lecture series with Aratrika Ganguly's lecture, Coolies in Indian Literature, Understanding Colonial History and Modern Slavery. But I've also done our first book discussion on the book China versus the US, Who Will Prevail by Professor Alfredo Hodi. The focus of the month of November has been on relevant topics with regards to social sciences research. We have been looking at the concept of war and warfare with one lecture, the first of which was by Nuno Rodriguez on psychological warfare, theory and practical implications. The second lecture is an enticingly new topic, outer space warfare challenges, theory, doctrine, strategies, and tactics, which we welcome today. AIRS is available on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram, as well as that it has its own site, airs.org.in. Thank you, and over to you, Arima.
Thank you, Ivan, for that concise introduction of us. And now let me introduce the speaker. Paul Szymanski has been conducting military operation research analysis for almost 44 years for the United States Air Force, Navy, Army, and Marines. The last 41 years has been exclusively in outer space program analysis, management and development of space warfare theory, policy, doctrine, strategies, and techniques. He has worked with air staff at the Pentagon, Secretary of the Air Force, the Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles, and the Air Force Research Lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Rome, New York, and at Ohio, with experience in operational field testing of missile systems at China Lake, California. He currently manages a private discussion group consisting of 4,250 handpicked members on LinkedIn with experience in space control and space situational awareness. With this, I invite Paul Szymanski to share with us some of the relevant insights and arguments about outer space warfare. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out late in the evening to see what I have to talk about. It's actually 5:30 in the morning here in central United States. So this is certainly a very hot topic, warfare in outer space, in terms of, well, I suppose it's such a hot topic that we've established the United States Space Force, and that's due to the threat from China, from Russia, documented threat, quite frankly. But I want to show you how the threat and the response and the concept of space warfare has gone back many, many decades. I'll go over the history of that. So a little bit about my experience already was talked about. So this is just a general introduction to the concepts of space warfare. And when you think about it, why space warfare? And all warfare essentially is not between machines. Ultimately, it's between human minds. It's between adversary commanders who are trying to transmit will, intent, force, and so you're dealing with the various commanders' culture, their knowledge, their education, their experience, their command and control networks, all their fears, everything that you have to deal with when it comes to fighting wars. And whether that's on the ground, in the air, on this high seas, it really is still a human element. In the commanders, they employ various military equipment and soldiers and so forth to transmit this intent, resolve, and will on each other. And I like this quote from Trotsky, because there's a lot of people who say, oh, we shouldn't have war in space and, we should try to avoid it. And that's all fine in some sense, but you might not be interested in war in space, but war is interested in you. And sooner or later, it's going to bite you, whether you like it or not. So space is way too important to the United States for us to not do anything about it, to ignore these threats coming at us. And I get the impression the same sort of thing is happening in India now with its anti-satellite tests and the knowledge that space is important to them. China is a threat in space, is well documented, and it's something that at least you got to start thinking about, start worrying about, start doing planning for resilience and survivability, and maybe offensive interactions. And it's interesting too, when you go back to even ancient warfare, this is a quote from an ancient Greek historian from almost 2,000 years ago. And he's saying it's not really the objective of war to annihilate those who've given provocation for it, but ultimately cause them to mend their ways. So, Clausewitz said, oh, war is politics by other means and things like that. And so again, it's just still the human element, political implications. And the thing with space warfare is, people unfortunately are used to conflicts on Earth. They're not used to conflicts in space. And so there's, I believe, a whole segment of the population around the world who would get very upset if you had war in space. And so I think war in space is very political. And you have to not only understand the implications during the conflict, but post-conflict. If you've generated a lot of debris in space, you've done a lot of what some people might perceive as bad things, you might lose some allies afterwards. On the other hand, you might appear as some big, strong country, and if you lose in space, it's possible you'd lose a war on the ground. So whoever beats you might gain allies, and you might just lose standing in the world, I guess. And there's all kinds of quotes. You guys have these briefings. I think one interesting one is by a major general I knew. He's now deceased, and it says, satellites have no mothers. And there's a concept that, well, if you've got your sons and daughters on the battlefield fighting, there's a certain emotional value there, where if you just have machines fighting in space, it's kind of abstract. So on one hand, it's very political, but on the other hand, almost no casualties of war in space. It's just, in a sense, machines fighting each other. And if you look at drones, let's say in Afghanistan, and people are controlling them all, it's probably more like 7,000 miles away in the United States. And it's almost like a video game because you just have a screen showing you what you're doing and you're pushing buttons and things. Now that still causes human casualties. But if you're talking about, in a sense, a video game in space where there's no casualties and all you've got is a computer and that's how you're directing these things, it truly does become a video game, except you're in the process of destroying or possibly losing billions of dollars of space gear and changing the political climate based on that. And that's kind of obscure, I think, probably to some of the people running these games. So potential space threats, if you look at what are some of the things that can hurt your space systems. First of all, you've got communication satellites. You've got space surveillance satellites that, looking at the ground, taking pictures, things like that, more like Earth resources kinds of things. You've got what's called ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance satellites that are more military oriented. You've got your communications satellites I mentioned. You've got the early warning, and those are watching for launches of strategic and tactical missiles on the battlefield. And then you've got various potential anti-satellites. For example, if you've got a satellite here, let's say it's a imagery satellite or maybe communication satellite. In order to control it, you need a relay satellite because this satellite might be on the other side of the Earth from where you want to get the pictures from. And that opens up a lot of vulnerabilities. You could have a cyber attack coming in towards that satellite that maybe is changing code and things like that. You can have the latest in thing are inspector satellites, where they get up close and personal to another satellite. And you've seen in the news about a Russian satellite going to various different French and American sensitive imagery, National Reconnaissance Office satellite systems. And that inspector satellite seems to be the latest in thing. Everyone on the block, so to speak, has to have one of these satellites. So the U.S. will, gleefully tell you about the 2 they have in orbit. They probably have more. The Chinese have some. The Russians have some. Now, I'm not sure what India's doing, though they probably should, because you really need to know what exactly is happening in space. And if there are secret doors on satellites with maybe a cavity inside and rails and space mines that can come out, maybe there's offensive weapon systems on supposedly harmless scientific satellites. You maybe want to know the size of antennas and frequencies and the size of optics so you can understand what resolution they can detect on the ground. So there's a lot of things that you want to know, because the trouble with space is it's tens of thousands of kilometers away and you're not really sure what's happening. And I've got a book on satellite failures, and it's amazing how engineers believe in perfection for space. And certain events happen like, oh, we didn't know this sensor would point at the bright moon or something like that. And then the satellite starts flipping out. And it takes them months to figure out what happened in space. And they're not really even sure, because you can't really directly image the satellite. You can do a little bit of fuzzy imaging of low Earth orbits, but certainly not geosynchronous or GPS kinds of satellites. So there's a certain instability, almost like in the old Cold War nuclear instability, that you're not sure what's happening. You might be, let's say, the United States is at war with China in the Western Pacific over Taiwan or something like that. And suddenly one of the United States satellites blinks out, stops working. And so you'd say, well, you scratch your head and it's like, well, what happened? And was there, a space, what's called space weather event, solar flares? Did a micrometeorite hit the satellite? Did it just fail naturally the same way your computer fails sometimes? Or was it intentional or maybe even accidental kinds of attacks? So you're not sure. And you could say, well, we're at war with China. Probably China did it, but maybe Russia's messing with you. Maybe they're trying to stir the pot. So there's certain degree of uh, self-restraint that I think, in a sense, are going to make you lose a space war. Because my calculations show you could have a whole space war happen and have large swaths of your space capability taken out in 24 hours, and then it's over with. So here's that instability of, well, we're talking about hypervelocity weapons in space. It's not like you can shield from it. You really can't protect from this stuff. So it might be whoever shoots first wins. And it might be whoever wins in space wins the terrestrial conflict. Now, there's another side of that coin, too, is that, let's say if someone wants to attack the United States with a terrestrial kind of conflict, if they were smart, they would take out our eyes and ears in space first so that we couldn't see what troop movements are happening, what the plans are, and so forth. So space is not a continuum in a sense. If you've got a satellite in orbit, you can't launch an attack or start maneuvering, let's say, that satellite at any place in the orbit. There's only specific places you can start the maneuvering to be able to get to another target in another orbit. So there's certain choke points in space where if you want to do a mass attack against an adversary's space assets, you want to pre-position these satellites at these key choke points, these jumping off points. And if you start concentrating on those points, and if, let's say, the United States has really good space surveillance assets and can see that happening, and these points aren't necessarily fixed, they're moving, but conceptually they're fixed, like geosynchronous orbits are fixed. If we could detect this buildup, we could maybe frustrate that buildup. We could go to the United Nations and say, hey, it looks like they're starting to attack, and they probably want to do an attack on the ground and maybe prevent the war on the ground from happening at all. So that's one beauty of space. The other thing is because it's so difficult to see what's happening, you're not really sure what's coming off, and you've got a lot of problems associated with that. So the next thing is, if you do have an inspector satellite, and let's say it's of the kind of a maintenance satellite, that's almost like, it would have manipulator arms on it and so forth. And it's there to maintain satellites, to pull in different electronic boards and things like that. Well, at the same time, it's the equivalent of me taking a satellite, putting it on a wheelbarrow, wheeling it into my garage, and then going at it with a drill and a saw, and let's cut these wires, do anything. So that's why I think we have these inspector satellites that probably have, jammers on them, cyber weapons, maybe lasers, maybe a little pea shooter. And then I like to point out too that there's a whole network on the ground of different satellite control stations. There's different, even looking at the satellite manufacturers and part suppliers are all part of the concept of space warfare, because you could maybe insert some sort of electronic integrated circuit that has your cyber code in it early on in the manufacturing process, and it ends up in the satellite, and you've got, suddenly during wartime, you can initiate it and do some sort of bad things. Same with attacking satellites on the ground, from ground systems, because ultimately a satellite's worthless if it doesn't communicate to the ground at some point. So that's a vulnerable region. Now, history of space war, you've got very long ago in ancient Roman times, Lucians had the Roman legions attacking the moon. And I guess they had giant spiders and things like that. But science fiction writers had been talking about space warfare for a very long time. And then in 1958, we had it's just a year after the Russians launched the first satellite in space, you had a lot of concepts being developed. And this is a space fighter attacking a satellite here, just a conceptual thing, kind of like Disney concepts. And from the very beginning, the United States and probably Russia started worrying very much that, well, these satellites are coming over, they could have nuclear bombs on them or something like that. We've got to be able to do something about it. And so we had things like the Bold Orion. We had on Johnston Island in the Pacific, we had a Thor missile that had a nuclear warhead on it to be able to launch and blow up near a satellite, and the radiation would kill the satellite. That was there for the 1960s. In 1975, the Russians will freely admit now they put an anti-aircraft cannon up on their Almaz spacecraft to shoot down satellites. And it's kind of like what would happen on the ground, where the shell coming from this anti-aircraft cannon would follow a ballistic arc just like on the ground, but then you'd have a reaction in the Almaz spacecraft, and so you'd have to re-maneuver afterwards and all. But they actually shot some of that. At the same time, the United States did their own anti-satellite test. I was working at the Pentagon at the time with the what's called the Program Element Monitor. And this was launched from an F-15 fighter aircraft. And it had a missile on it that would go up into space and, create a lot of debris and so forth. But it did test against one semi-dead satellite. And the Program Element Monitor at the time at the Pentagon told me the whole purpose of the program was as a negotiating chip with the Russians. We're still on, right? Can you still hear me?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to ask the question at the end of it, or so would you like to take the question right away? Hello?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up then. I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so do you want to take the questions right away, or would you like to take it at the end of the lecture?
I could take questions now. I'll take a little longer, but that's fine. While it's fresh in this person's mind. So go for it.
Yeah. All right. Rajit, I think it was you who was going to ask the question, right? Please go ahead.
What the fuck is that?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. I think, sir, you should continue the lecture. I think he's left the meeting as well. I'm extremely
Oh, okay. For what that was worth. And then we had the Russian kinetic anti-satellite, and it was a missile. What you do is you knew when a satellite was coming over, you launched it from the ground before the satellite got there, and it would meet the satellite if you did your calculations right. It would essentially be a shotgun approach and blow up a bunch of steel ball bearings when you're near the satellite, with the hope that some of them would, hit the satellite. And then you just have to search on the internet. There's various Russian concepts of ground-based lasers to go against satellites. And quite frankly, you can, as a civilian, you can get like a 7-watt laser without any problem. And if you got the right equipment to be able to direct that laser, and let's say it has a good figure of merit, so it doesn't, expand too much, You can at least blind satellites if you want. It doesn't take that much. And here's some of the Russian concepts you can look up. There's it looks like some of the United States concepts of a space plane attacking a satellite. Just see it says Soviet Union on the side. And when you think of space warfare, there's three parts to a space system. You have to think of the whole thing as a system. And you don't go out and say, oh, let's kill this satellite, take out the satellite. You really, the question you have to ask is, you want to deny a capability over a certain time frame and a certain geographic location. So deny the ability to image the battlefield for 24 hours or something like that. So there's various ways to do it. You can attack the satellite, you can attack the ground system that controls the satellite, or you can attack the link between the two and jam it and so forth. So this is an example in Desert Storm where they had what is called heavy earth terminals for major satellite communications traffic. And there was a bunch of these in Iraq, and we bombed them, as that's showing there. Okay, so there really has been space warfare attacks, maybe even major conflicts, and I'll go over some of those. And a lot of these are circumstantial. I could mathematically prove that there was a war in space in 2014 over the Ukrainian conflict. But starting out, I have trouble finding where my mouse is. There's the mouse. Okay. And there was a Federal Communications Commission ground site in Laurel, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. And they monitor communication traffic for interference. And I visited there in the 1980s. And the head of the station told me that the U.S. satellite called ComSat back then in the 1960s started getting jammed, and they couldn't use the satellite. And it went on for several days. And the satellite owners rotated the satellite to see where the signal is coming from, what was the maximum value. And it was coming from off the eastern coast of the United States. And they figured it was a Russian trawler jamming the satellite. So that's the earliest I can come up with. Next is the CSAT. And that's a NASA satellite from the 1970s. It was just there to measure sea height, height of the ocean waves, sort of thing, I guess, for weather purposes. And when I just first started out in this whole area, I was 20-year-old, I had a NASA scientist tell me that when they first turned on that satellite, they were shocked to find out that he was able to detect submarines at operating depth, hundreds of feet below the surface, were disturbing the waves enough that you could see, where the submarines were going. And so this satellite ended up being the most important satellite in space at the time because it negated 1/3 of the nuclear triad, which is, ICBMs, bombers, and submarines. So this NASA scientist told me, oh, well, they faked its death of CSAT and turned it off. And that's what I heard. And then 20 years later, I was working at a facility that did imagery of ground assets using all kinds of specialized tools to get fuzzy imagery of lower satellites like you see here. And some of the pictures of CSAT, you could see was all terribly bent out of shape, like it had been exploded.
Excuse me.
It looked like, yes.
Mr. Szymanski, is that right?
Yes.
I have a question regarding the matter of Space Force.
Sure.
Seems to me like a really interesting subject, really interesting theory. But before Space Force, the fuck is that in background?
Okay, so another interesting thing is like in the 1980s, neither the United States or Russia can get any launches off the ground. Every time we launched a satellite in space, the booster would explode, it'd fall into the ocean, and it happened on both sides. So it was very suspicious, like there was attacks going on back and forth. You know, if you do it to us, we'll do it back to you. So there was something going on there as far as I could tell. And then in the teens, we had an incident that I can't really talk about, but it's rumored that a drunken Russian colonel started the war. And then I have a whole briefing on the Russian, well, the Ukrainian conflict, where again, there was multiple attacks back and forth, and there'd be all kinds of Russian satellites that would stop working in 2014 during the Ukrainian conflict. And there's a lot of circumstantial things like the Yamel Russian communication satellite that was supposed to cover the eastern Ukraine, couple $100 million satellite system. It launched and then immediately fell on a Chinese village while Putin was in China selling space technologies. So that's kind of circumstantial, but it's kind of interesting too. But what I can mathematically prove is that the Russian GLONASS satellites, and that's the GPS equivalent for navigation, started blinking out. This chart here is showing you how a user in Great Britain, located here, his actual location reported by the GLONASS satellites was 40 kilometers off. And so it was published when these GLONASS satellites stopped working, date and time. So I have my orbital dynamics software, and I said, well, let's just see where those satellites were. And it looks like at that exact date and time they would blink off, they would come over Central Australia. And if you look up on the internet, there's an NSA listening site at Alice Springs in Central Australia. Been there since the 1960s. And every time a Russian GLONASS satellite would come over, it would stop working. And it started exactly 6:30 in the morning. And yeah, I know these guys, I know how this works. They come in at 6 a.m., they get their coffee, they start testing, and then at 6:30 a.m., they start attacking. And if there were several GLONASS satellites within view, they would be attacked in numerical order. So GLONASS 1, 2, and 3. So it was certainly intentional attacks. And it was sending a message, because nowadays space weapons, the cyber variety, can be carried around in suitcases. You don't need heavy earth terminals and things like that, like you used to be able to do 20, 30 years ago. And so these cyber weapons could have been on a ship at sea or at embassies around the world. So it wouldn't be so obvious it was happening, because anyone, you can get orbital dynamics software, you can download the orbital elements online, and you could figure this out. But on the other side, you can't be too obscure with these attacks, because the whole point was not to take out GLONASS. We didn't really care. The whole point was to send a message to the Russians. And so it has to be an obvious message and obvious to them that they're being attacked. Now, there was a back and forth after that. And so I assumed that there was a large space war that had occurred with multiple assets over several months' time. And then the Russians attacked the American banking network. There was like 5 major banks in New York City that had cyber attacks. And again, it was in the press for a few days, and suddenly it was hushed up. You didn't see anything more. But the banks would say, oh, gee, look at, it looks like it's coming from Russia, these cyber attacks. And tens of millions of bank accounts and stock accounts were downloaded. And then nothing happened. The accounts didn't end up on the internet and sold, and cyber criminals using them and all that. And it was obvious that it was an extortion attempt by Russia to say, okay, stop messing in the Ukraine, or we'll release these accounts. And you could see that suddenly President Obama stopped saying anything negative about the Russians and the Ukrainian conflict. And 1 week later, all parties to the conflict were at the negotiating table, and the war essentially stopped. There's still like little incidents and things like that. So my assessment is that the US did very well in the war in space, in the space environment, but they ultimately lost the war because they lost it on the ground. The Russians took a combined arms approach, attacked a different way. And the other lesson here too is like just one of those 5 banks that are attacked, Mellon Bank, spends $250 million a year in cybersecurity, and the Russians went through them just like nothing. And the lesson here is, I don't care how much you spend as a company and how secure you think you are. If a country's attacking you, you're not going to make it. And then finally, we've got these, something happened afterwards. Now I know a GPS satellite a while later failed, stopped working in the same manner that the Russian GLONASS one stopped working. And so I wondered if that is, another tit for tat kind of attack. But I think there was other major incidents because, I've been in this world, like I said, for 46 years. And usually there's 2 or 3 job announcements a year for these kinds of space warfare kinds of jobs. Now there's hundreds of job announcements, and maybe even thousands. And you could see the whole US government panicking like crazy. You can see the Congress in the United States not able to pass any kind of bipartisan bill, except when it came to Space Force, both sides of the aisle agreed, oh yeah, we really need a Space Force, because they were briefed on something really bad happened. And people told me something bad happened. But I'm retired, so I no longer have my security clearances, so they couldn't tell me what it was. So the same thing's happening around the world where everybody else knows what happened, and they're establishing their own space forces and so forth. So, a lot of this has been happening under wraps, and now it's, a big thing. And you could, in a sense, space provides another rung on the conflict escalation ladder, because you can show resolve and intent without the general population knowing what you've done. And so I've illustrated some, in a sense, political, diplomatic, space warfare kind of incidents that, had major implications, like for the Ukrainian conflict, but people didn't really know about it, so they didn't get upset. It's like the Falkland Islands. I'm sure Great Britain didn't really care about the Falkland Islands. They just cared about the ego thing of losing some territory. So space provides, I guess, a safety release valve. And then there's different kinds of attacks. There's got to be subtleties here, because a lot of satellites, they, like Intelsat, has multiple channels, multiple transponders that different countries use. So you can't have a missile going up, blowing up the whole thing, and you're going to get half the world mad at you. You have to have what's called a surgical strike. So you've got to be able to, let's say, just take out one channel. And there's different flavors, so to speak, of ways of doing that. And one is what's called disrupt, which means you have temporarily and partial impairment of the satellite. So you're taking out just one channel for maybe 24 hours, and then it comes back afterwards. And then to deny a capability is to temporarily take out the whole satellite system, but then it's able to come back. So maybe it's an imagery satellite and use a laser to blind it for a few minutes when it's over the battlefield or something like that. And then you have degrade, which is the permanent but partial impairment. So, for example, I believe some Indian satellites are both imagery and communication. So if you took out the imagery portion, that part is permanently destroyed by a high-powered laser, but it still can be a communication satellite and so forth. And then destroy is the permanent and full elimination. It's a smoking hole kind of thing. And then there's concepts of delay, where I guess in a sense the jammer delays the signal. It delays, and really what you're trying to do is delay the information on the battlefield to the point where, well, it's useless now. I could have used that yesterday, but now I can't use that information. Or even deceive. Can you make false information? And can you combine delay and deceive? You can delay the transmission of the good information because you know you want the false information to get through. And then there's other aspects, especially in the covert world, and one is non-attribution, and that is the adversary knows his satellite system has stopped working, but he doesn't know who did it. Now, it could be obvious, I'm at war with this country, it's probably then, but you're not sure. And then what's called plausible deniability. And that you see that a lot in politics of, oh, no, I didn't do it. And essentially it is, let's, for example, for the United States, some of these covert weapon systems, the president of the United States not even briefed on them, because then he could say, well, gee, I don't know anything about that. It wasn't us, kind of thing. And then the third concept is non-public. Don't be so dramatic about it. And so, you know, I mentioned you could take out a satellite, you can take out the link, you can take out the ground system controlling the satellite. Well, taking out the ground system, there's a smoking hole in the ground. You know, it's obvious something happened. If the satellite, let's say an inspector satellite came by and no one knew it was there, and it, let's say, clipped some wires from the solar panels, and then it floated off and the satellite stopped working, and you don't know why, and you know, it's not public. The public doesn't have its own radars to see what happened. You know, all these things are important, and they're more subtle forms of warfare, I guess. So there's certain unique characteristics of space systems. One is space is global. And so very early on in the 50s and 60s, it was established that, well, you can't take a fighter jet and fly it over my country, but I guess you can fly those satellites over because that's just the way the physics are and we can't prevent it. And so it's kind of acceptable. So even if you do tactical actions in space, you're just attacking one satellite, maybe just attacking a small part of that satellite. It has strategic implications. And let's say you want to deny an adversary the ability to image the battlefield and see, oh, we're doing this sneak attack around the center or something like that. And so you say, well, let's not allow the adversary to downlink this photo. And so you take out the ground station or you jam it or something like that in the battlefield. But the trouble is the satellite moves on, and you know, 1,000 miles later, it's over another country, and you could downlink the photo there and then transmit it back to the battlefield. So does that mean you got to jam that too? And then the next one, and suddenly you're jamming 10 or 20 places around the world. Do you even have that capabilities? And you can get a lot of trouble with 20 different countries. So anything you do in space, I think, ultimately has strategic implications along with the political acceptability. So that's what I'm mentioning here. It's highly political, and though hidden from public view. And also, it's not only hidden from public view, but hidden from military view too, because it's just so darn hard to figure out what happened in space. You can't directly image the satellite. You say, oh, it just stopped working. Well, gee, I don't know. And anti-satellites don't have big red stars painted on the side. They probably have 90% of their parts are Western parts. You can't really, you know, maybe you have an inspector satellite and you could maneuver it over there, but that takes days and weeks to accomplish. So, you know, the incident is kind of over with by then. So it's very hard to figure out what's happening. And people say, oh, gee, you know, it's space. You can't hide them, you know, behind a hill up there. But radars only go several thousand kilometers. The only way to really see what's happening in space is optical. And it's very easy to reduce your optical signature. I mean, if you think of a satellite as a box, and the sunlight bounces off one face of the box and then goes back to Earth and you see a bright spot in space. Well, if you just twist the box, the attitude of the satellite, you can make any of these speculars fly off into deep space. And you end up the satellite, seeing the analyses, the satellite's like 18th magnitude in terms of brightness. You can look up in the 1970s, there was a patent in America for a stealth satellite, where it's barbell shaped, and they'll show you a picture of it and things like that. So there's, a lot of ways to hide things. And then wartime actions have potential peacetime consequences. I mentioned, certainly the space debris generation that can be up there for hundreds of years. Will you need new outer space treaties in one way or the other afterwards? Are you going to have allies shift, both red and blue, good and bad sides? And then the other thing is it's very difficult to maneuver around in space. It takes time, takes a lot of fuel and so forth. So for a particular battle, let's say the Western Pacific again, you can only fight it with assets you have at hand at the time, especially if a space war is over with in 24 hours. So you don't really have maneuvering capabilities that can change the battlefield. So you got to understand the battlefield and do a lot of modeling and simulations to truly understand what you need at that time. And then there's the question of, well, do allies even count? If you have a war over the Western Pacific and you have allies in NATO in Europe, well, they can't move any of their satellites there to help you. It'd be too late. And oh, by the way, even if they did move them, and it took them weeks to move, because they maneuver satellites in geosynchronous, they just used up all their fuel. And so the lifetime of the satellite has been cut in half or something like that. So it's really a big thing to do. The other thing is space, the physics is kind of different. The Apollo astronauts learned this hard lesson when they were trying to maneuver closer to different rendezvous that they were trying to do. You see it, you say, oh, okay, I'm a few kilometers distance. Let me step on the gas and go closer. Well, if you step on the gas and start maneuvering, what happens is you get to a higher orbit. You don't get closer to it. So you have to kind of really figure it out how this all works. And there's military implications. For example, you have a very important satellite that you want to defend. And normally people would say, well, look at all around you and see who's close to you. Well, closeness in space is different. A satellite on the other side of the Earth is actually close to you, because if he's in the same altitude and inclination, it takes very little maneuvering fuel and time to come up close to you and attack you. So my definition of close is what's the amount of rocket fuel and time it takes to get to you. So there's a certain conceptual difference, a certain visualization of what's considered close. Now, I think I've kind of gone my hour, haven't I? You want me to stop now? Like I said, I can go on and on.
There's a few more minutes if you want to wrap it up.
Okay, and then we could get some questions.
Yeah.
So
I've put
now
yeah,
getting back to this concept of it's easy to hide things. Well, this is showing you a chart of lost space objects, and we lose them all the time, particularly high inclination orbits. That's the degree. And they're very difficult to track, especially if they're very what's called eccentric. They're not round orbits, they're very oblong. And so we've lost satellites for years. Like the Russians have, I remember one satellite, scientific satellite, that we couldn't track. And the years later, they told us where it was at. So it's like very easy, I think, to hide things. And you can do strange things like 0 degrees inclination LEO satellites, which nobody does because it doesn't cover the Earth. But if it's an anti-satellite, all it has to do is increase its altitude, which takes much less fuel, and attack any LEO satellites that come by. There's a whole bunch of very large rocket boosters from the 60s and 70s that were launched, and they're floating out there. And it seems to me some of those like exhaust cones are the size of rooms. You could hide a satellite inside one of those exhaust cones, and no one's going to use up all the fuel with an inspector satellite to go to each launch booster and inspect each launch cone and see if someone's hiding in there. And they, you know, when one of these boosters goes over, let's say, Antarctica, you can, maneuver out of there, this anti-satellite, and go attack something. And so a lot of people have these concepts of, oh, we know what's happening. And that's the first way to lose a war, is to be overconfident. And then there's other physics kinds of thing. There was a European satellite that was measuring gravity, because it's different around the world. As a matter of fact, there's kind of a Sargasso Sea of satellites. If satellites are dead and not controlled over the southern Indian Ocean, I guess there's less gravity there, and the satellites tend to bunch there. So there's all kinds of ways that, so this European satellite was so low in the atmosphere measuring gravity, it had actually stubby wings because of the atmosphere, but it was still in space. And the only way they could keep it up, keep up the satellite from going out of orbit, was to continuously thrust with electric thrusters for 2.5 years. So it seems to me, if you've got a bunch of anti-satellites hidden inside of harmless looking, research scientific satellites, and you suddenly want to cause a space war because you want to attack on the ground, you would hide these satellites. You would wait until you don't know, what's happening. And just before the war starts, you start the electric thrusters. And suddenly, all of the calculations, the Keplerian physics of satellites go out the door. This thing's thrusting, even if it's thrusting slightly, and the radars can't track them. They can't figure out where they're going. It would confuse the whole system, and it happens all the time. These radars on the ground get tasked to say, well, track this particular satellite of interest, and they calculate, say, well, it should be coming over the horizon about now. And if it doesn't, they say, oh, well, and then something else comes over 10 minutes later and say, well, we don't know what this is. It's not in the catalog. It's called a UCT, uncorrelated target. And just before the war starts, you suddenly have thousands of uncorrelated targets. And maybe you have like daughter satellites come off of big satellites. And again, come off over Antarctica or someplace where there's no sensor systems, and start maneuvering off somewhere else. So there's all these ways to hide and confuse, because again, warfare is all about deception, ultimately. So what are the various means of attacking space systems? And you have to think of it as a large kind of thing. And that is, from the get-go, you could have diplomatic and economic attacks. You could outer space treaties. You could have all kinds of agreements. You could put pressure on countries. Oh, don't develop those ASAT systems. Now, the trouble is they're very easy to hide. You can hide them inside satellites. You can hide them on the ground. Who knows what this missile's for, hidden somewhere. You don't really know. And then you can have satellites smash into other satellites. You can't have just a dumb satellite do that. It has to have all kinds of fine maneuvering jets, because you're talking about hypervelocities, and it's got to have sensor on it to see where it's at and maneuver around and things like that. So you could do that, but I think you can hide it very easy. And then there's economic kind of attacks of, oh, we'll put sanctions on your country if we find you're building these anti-satellite systems, or we're going to not allow certain key, let's say, sensor technologies and things like that to be imported into your country to kind of delay, I guess, the development of your anti-satellite systems or make them less effective. So that is space warfare, doing diplomatic economic. Now, there's all kinds of cyber attacks that you can do too. And so that you have the classic jamming. Spoofing is, fooling him into thinking something is or isn't. In one sense, spoofing could be more information warfare. Let's say you have a satellite inspector come at you, and the satellite inspector looks very threatening. And so you maneuver out of the way. And then a few months later, you have the satellite inspector come back again. You maneuver out of the way. And suddenly you're making the satellite use up its fuel reserves. And also, if a satellite has to maneuver away, many times it has to fold in its solar panels and put covers on its sensors and things like that, and then start maneuvering. And then it takes days to reconfigure the satellite and test it out and all that. Well, you just denied the ability of that satellite to do its job for the battlefield, to image or communicate. So it's the same as blowing it up. The thing, you couldn't get it to work. You could do all kinds of funny things in terms of a cyber attack can go inside and make the satellite do funny things. Let's say make it point its sensors to the sun, so they burn out the sensors. Make it start spinning wildly, so the ground can't communicate with it. All satellites have heat exchangers. There's no atmosphere up there to get rid of excess heat. And so they have these radiators that radiate out into deep space. Well, if you change the attitude of the spacecraft and have those radiators point at the sun, you could overheat the satellite and have it burn out. You could maybe put some cyber code in there, and maybe inserted it years earlier with some special chip that was inserted during the manufacturing process. And you could have it turn off random subsystems. And maybe you could be clever about it and say, well, every time you're over this place on Earth, turn off the heat maintenance routines in the satellite. And so the ground controllers would think, well, it has something to do with that place on Earth, but it really doesn't. So you would confuse them. Or maybe you would randomly turn off things at different times and just totally confuse what's happening. And just this year, the US did something interesting. They had a session, an exercise, an event, whatever you want to call it, called Hack the Sat. And what it is they invited hackers from around the world to break into one of their satellites. And now they put together a fake satellite, and they said, okay, and there was teams of hackers around the world again who would attempt to break in. And whoever was able to win this contest got, like, I think it was a $50,000 prize. So they just finished that. Now they're thinking about doing that again. So they're testing the systems and see what you can do on that. And then there's this whole concept of directed energy sensors. And by directed energy, you can also have high-powered microwaves. For example, this is a sticky bomb concept from years ago for the ground, but it was being proposed for space that would, I guess, essentially stick to something and put out a high-powered pulse that would destroy the computers and things like that. This is here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a SOR site with high-powered lasers doing research into space. This is a mobile laser jammers. You've got all kinds of, high-powered lasers and so forth. This is showing you a picture from an imagery sensor and what it would look like if a laser is jamming you. Of course, you got to get the right wavelengths for what the sensor is able to detect. And if it's not bright enough, the attacking laser, you might just take out a few pixels because it's going to image the bright laser and not be able to see the few pixels on the ground. So you'd have to have a blooming effect of it's such a powerful laser that's going to be bouncing around in the optics train and things like that. But maybe you don't want it too powerful because you don't want to burn the whole thing out. You want it to recover. Depends on what conflict level you're at, essentially. And I have a whole briefing on conflict levels in space and are they linked to the ground? If you, let's say, blow up a satellite in the space, would that induce an adversary to blow up something on the ground? Would he sink a destroyer? You know, is that an equivalent kind of thing? Or can conflicts be just put in space where you're not going to have any human casualties or anything like that? You know, you're losing billions of dollars of space gear and maybe creating debris and things like that. But maybe that's more acceptable in one sense than a war on the ground. But then I think people get very emotional about the concept of war in space. And then you don't even have to attack the satellite. There's, you know, iron bombs taking out ground targets. So talking here, you're talking maybe special forces going in. I went to the Special Forces University in Florida earlier in the year and briefed them on, for some reason, they were very interested in space warfare. And some of the Special Forces guys took me aside later and says, you know, it's interesting. I think we camped out next to a satellite terminal, one of these heavy Earth terminals, but they didn't know, you know, so it's a different way of thinking and so forth. But that's, you know, one way of taking out space systems. And then we have the more classical, or, you know, what India did, kinetic kill vehicles causing debris. And then I mentioned all these kind of inspector satellites that you can grab the satellite and pull it to useless orbits. You can disassemble it and cut things. You can even paint systems. You could paint the sensors so they can't see. You could use a certain kind of paint that would, after a few weeks, kind of float away and go away into space. And so it would come back. You could paint solar panels so that, you know, they no longer provide enough energy for it. If you painted radiators, they you wouldn't be able to radiate out to space and the satellite would burn up. You can paint antennas so that their figure of merit would go way down and wouldn't communicate too well. I mean, I saw one analysis on, so getting back to solar panels, that if you painted just a small corner of the solar panel for one of these very large geosynchronous satellites, the satellite would have differential solar pressure. I mean, the sun makes pressure, the photons, and the satellite would slowly start spinning out on it because of that. So there's, you know, there's strange things that can happen in space. And then it's not only in space. I mean, this is what happened to a weather satellite on the ground. They didn't lift it right and it smashed it, you know, $100 million satellite. Of course, who knows if some spy came in and removed some bolts or something like that. I mean, there's, you know, various things that you can do. Here are more kinetic kill vehicles, satellites. And down here, these are inspector. Now they're called maintenance satellites, and they've got all these arms that can go around and, you know, manipulate the satellite. But if you can do that, you can also kill the satellite. Now, the one vulnerability, though, is we don't have artificial intelligence good enough to have this this satellite do all the manipulations on its own. You have to have a ground controller with a, you know, the joysticks trying to figure it out. And for the low Earth orbit satellites, they come over and maybe 6 to 8 minutes later, they're gone. So what you need is a relay satellite to continuously, you know, for maybe hours, be able to control the robot that's taking this satellite apart or inspecting it or seeing, is there some sort of nuclear weapons on board or something. So the most vulnerable part of these inspector satellites are the relay satellites, I think. They're probably the prime target. And here I have a picture I came up of a maintenance satellite, disassembling a satellite. This is a kinetic kill vehicle, and you notice it has all this fuel and all these exhaust ports, and it's got a sensor. It's got to be able to detect what it's attacking. And there's certain areas of space, what's called sun synchronous orbit, and these are times in an Earth orbit where it comes over the Earth at 10:30 in the morning, every place on Earth. So it's synchronized with the sun, and it's got to be about that time because you need some shadows in order to take pictures and get the contrast. So there's a whole bunch of satellites in those orbits. They're very unique. They're like 97 degrees inclination and 480 kilometers up. And it's the same thing with weather satellites and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of satellites there, and maybe some of the, military imaging birds, I don't know. But if you want an anti-satellite to go against it, the best you can do is give the general region where the satellite is, especially if it's maneuvered. And so you send this anti-satellite there, and it's got to maneuver and all. But before that, it's got to know which target it is. If there's a whole bunch of satellites in its field of view, it's got to be able to determine which is the target and which is something I better not attack. That's another country. So I think there's a lot of issues there. I've got another maybe fanciful, but maybe not thing I did here is two maintenance satellites fighting it out amongst themselves. And this is a concept for a repair satellite too. So it's the latest in thing for people to be having these maintenance satellites and inspector satellites. You want me to continue?
So it's 7:15 here. So I think 5 more minutes and we can start the question answer round. If that is okay with you?
Okay. Now, there's getting back to maybe something that's more interest to you people is what are rules of engagement? I mean, at least in the United States, you just don't blow things up and cause escalation in conflict. So you have to really try to control conflict escalation on the ground and in space. So these are the various levels of war I came up with. And that is, there's peacetime, and I inserted a new thing, sort of a space crisis versus conventional terrestrial and space. And I mentioned earlier these different levels of attacks. The easiest levels, you're just deceiving, or maybe just temporarily disrupting a small part of the satellite, or you're disrupting more and more, or permanently killing. And what are you allowed to do at the different levels of conflict? So if you at peacetime, you can play around, do some deception, maybe some delay. You can't be too serious. And that's why I say maybe here. But if you're at peacetime, you better not be blowing satellites out of the sky, or you're going to cause war. And that's essentially what I'm doing here. But if you're already in crisis in space and bad things are happening, you're allowed to do a few more things. And you really can't be blowing things up until you've gotten to maybe conventional war on the ground. People are dying on the ground. Who cares about a bunch of satellites by then, I guess. So that it's just sort of a conflict escalation ladder. And then you get to weapons release authorization levels. And that is, how much control do you have over the satellites? So if the satellite had a self-defense mechanism, and if something comes close, it's going to shoot back at it, let's say. Now, the trouble is things come close all the time just from natural orbital dynamics. So how much control do you have? And so there's levels like space positive control, meaning, you're not going to let the satellite shoot anything unless you get a specific order for it, versus, well, how much autonomy do I give to it? How much do we allow it to shoot back? And when you end up with general war happening on the ground, you might just give total allowance to the satellite to shoot at anything that comes close. So that's just trying to give you a sense of levels of that. Okay, questions, please.
Okay, so there are a few very interesting questions that we've gotten from the audience. So I'll begin with the question that Evangeline has asked. So the first question that she asks is, could you talk about the ethical implications of outer space warfare?
Been mentioning it all along that you're talking about no human lives. I mean, maybe some astronauts, but who wants to attack the International Space Station? What's the point? Kind of thing. And so you're really just talking about, you know, there's treaties about, no warfare in Antarctica, no weapons on the moon. Well, isn't that where you want us to have a war? In Antarctica, where no one's there, you know, on the moon, where no one's there, kind of thing. Isn't it better? Maybe you'd have a war in space, and if you lose the war in space, well, we're not even going to start the war on the ground, kind of thing. So that's kind of a Machiavellian thing about that. And I go back to the original quote I had is like, you might not be interested in war, but it's interested in you. So sooner or later, you can sit there and say, I'm peaceful, I'm peaceful. And the other side has all these great weapons they've been developing and testing for years. And they attack your systems and you say, oh, gee, now, now I just lost the war. So it's kind of childish to sit there and say, oh, we're not going to do anything. And diplomatically, of course, you're going to say that. You know, of course, the United States is going to be saying, oh, yeah, we don't have space weapons and we're really good and all. Well, you know, countries have been developing space weapons for decades, probably the last 50, 60 years. You know, we've had all kinds of things. And I guess it's just a military necessity. Now, one conceptual thing, though, is space is there to support the ground. It's not there for themselves. Now, if you talk to the Air Force space types, which I've worked with for 4 decades, they think space is its own thing, you know, and all that. Same with the Air Force. I mean, really think about it. Air forces are there to support the ground. We don't have people living in balloons that they have to defend in the air. It's all about the ground, you know, all about us on the ground. And same with space. It's all about providing, you know, GPS and communications and weather and all this stuff, not only to forces, but to civilians. The space is not there for their own right. Now we have the Space Force. I bet you they think, oh yeah, we're there for ourselves and all that. And that would be true years later when we have space colonies, where, okay, now we got to defend the colonies. And the same with, you know, has happened throughout history for tens of thousands of years on the ground. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's some insights into it.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. The next question is that space programming takes a lot of investment and money, power and resources. Is it really worth it to be taking the battle into the space rather than keeping it on the ground? So especially in terms of investment and money.
Well, yeah, that certainly is an open question for some countries. Now, you look at the United States, it projects its forces tens of thousands of miles away. So if you're a country that is inward looking and only needs to protect its borders from some potential threats, maybe you don't need global space systems, even though, you know, it'd be nice to see, have imagery satellites to see if a country's right next door, to see if they're building up at the border, to see about their weapons programs that they're testing. And, you know, gee, this factory now has 10 times the number of cars in the parking lot. They must be building new, you know, tanks or something. Is that, you know, you really need that stuff. You need what's called signals intelligence to see, well, this general officer is going to this particular infantry base. He's never been there before. He's a 4-star, you know, it sounds like something's up. So you need that. Now, getting back to countries that want to play on the world stage and want to project forces. I don't know how you do that without space. Let's say, going back again, Western Pacific, war with China over Taiwan or something like that. And do you really think a naval carrier battle group can be in the Western Pacific and not have satellites available to communicate back to the United States, to understand what its rules are and things like that? I mean, I don't think they practice troposcatter communications anymore, and you wouldn't even get the data rates you need. Do you think you would be launching these aircraft to bomb targets if you didn't have GPS to have accurate weapons? If you couldn't figure out the routes you should go in to avoid, anti-aircraft missiles, you didn't have imagery and signals intelligence to tell you. I mean, I don't think you could prosecute wars. So you can, it's expensive. And oh, by the way, it's quite vulnerable. And people think maybe it isn't. But I think it is. And, they say, well, we're going to have Starlink, with 20,000 satellites out there. You don't have 20,000 anti-satellites to take all those out, and so it's very secure. Yeah, but the trouble is you've got so many satellites that are relatively close to each other. They're going to have automatic algorithms on board to stay away from each other. So if one satellite says, oops, I'm getting too close to another one, let me start thrusting away. Okay, you can do a cyber attack and you insert a negative sign instead of a positive sign into the algorithms on board the whole constellation, because the whole constellation is communicating to each other. And when the satellite says, I'm coming too close, let me start thrusting, it starts thrusting closer to the satellite, not farther away. And suddenly you destroyed the whole satellite constellation in a matter of minutes, I think. I'm not enough of an expert. So there's always clever ways. And then certain countries say, oh, gee, I can't afford these big missiles that are launching anti-satellites and things like that. Well, there's, at least a few years ago, there used to be a website called gpsjammers.com. You could buy all kinds of jammers for GPS. The Russians were selling all kinds of ground-based jammers. Every country has their very clever young people who are hackers. And you probably can hack a satellite. Matter of fact, it wasn't too long ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a lot of satellites, commercial satellites, didn't have encrypted links. And so it's probably relatively easy, even if it's encrypted this or that, it's relatively easy to get in to satellite systems for with very clever people. And let me just take an example. There's 100,000 people in China working space systems. That's the unclassified number. The classified number is much higher. Let's say you just take 5% of those engineers, put them away in some secret buildings for 10 years and say, develop these anti-satellite hacking systems to go against, let's say, American satellites. And some dark night, maybe Christmas Eve at 3 a.m., they're going to attack these satellites. And some poor guy who's, just a first lieutenant out of college is sitting, the dark shift at the satellite control terminals. And he sees, something funny's happening here. I don't know what it is. Now you have these 5,000 engineers and PhDs who spent 10 years developing very clever ways to attack the satellite versus this kid just out of college. Who do you think is going to win that contest? When it really comes down to it. Now, I have a semi-solution to that, and that is I've been proposing the last decade or more that we ought to put together a space game. And, not with aliens, things like that, but very realistic physics-based space game to be able to play Space Wars. And you give this game to the people at the, Air Force and Army and Navy academies, and you have them play the game. And every week, whoever wins, and actually winning in space is kind of difficult to define, but whoever wins gets $100. And that's 5,000 a year. That's not even in a military budget. That's nothing. And those kids would go wild, and they would develop all the doctrine, strategy, and tactics you can to fight space wars. And if nothing else, you'd be training those kids so that when they're in that watch center at 3 a.m. and they see these funny things happening, they could say, oh, well, that sounds like Joe's attack he did against me last year. I know what's happening. So there's a certain situational awareness associated with that. Okay, did I go off mark on that answer? Next
No, so
question.
not at all. It's a very interesting answer that you just given. So the next question is by Pindak, and he says that is there a regulatory body in the UN that governs space program?
Yes, and it's actually located in Vienna, Austria. Something that I forget the exact acronym. They love those long acronyms, but for space. Now, I've tried contacting them many times. None of them seem interested in any of this, but there's what's called the Outer Space Treaty, and it says, thou shalt not put weapons of mass destruction in space and on celestial bodies and things like that. And what they're referring to is nuclear weapons. Well, we have anti-satellites. They're not mass destruction. They're individual attacks. So they seem to be not covered by that provision. Even the Russians got around that provision. They had what's called the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, FOBS. And this was the 70s, I think. And what they would shoot a missile up into space. It would go from the south of the United States, an attack from the south, because all the United States radars are in the north, because that's the quickest way. But it wouldn't complete a full orbit. So these nuclear attack missiles will be in partial orbit. So they get around the treaty, but there's still mass destruction, and whether you define it as space or not. And you know how lawyers go. They'll always find a way around it. And even the nuclear, it's probably pretty easy to hide nuclear weapons. You're not sure how many they have. Now get to the space. How to hide space weapons. I bet you there's space weapons up there now, hidden inside harmless looking scientific satellites. And how do you know? You can go take X-ray pictures of satellites, even though we know we got these in satellite inspectors. Well, why do we have satellite inspectors? That's pretty costly, they must fear something that they need to inspect, ultimately. Now, going back, another semi-interesting thing, going back to the Outer Space Treaty from the 1960s, it says you cannot own celestial bodies. Well, if you look it up, I was astounded a few months ago to find out that there's over 80 countries around the world that never signed that treaty, that you can't own celestial bodies. And it seems to me there's a lot of commercial launch providers now. They're building their own launch vehicles to go out into space, and some of them are talking about landing on the moon and all that. If they move some of their operations to one of these 80 countries that never signed the treaty, launched from there, landed an astronaut on the moon, he plants a flag and says, I own the moon now for this country. And oh, by the way, the country will lease it back to my commercial interest for 99 years, and I could take all the minerals out and stuff like that. Can you get away with that? Now, some space lawyers say, oh no, it's accepted principle that no one can own it. And it's like, well, you mean countries are going to be bound by that treaty even if they never signed it, And you think of, well, China is doing all sorts of funny things in the South Chinese Sea. It sounds like they don't really care about treaties as much. What if, and they're landing astronauts on the moon in the next few years. What if 10 minutes before the astronaut lands on the moon, China says, okay, we abrogate that treaty. We don't believe in it anymore. Now we're going to own the moon, So treaties, yeah, maybe that's interesting or not. I don't think it stops people from doing what they want to do, especially when they're talking about very covert programs, very small things like satellites, things that are very hidden. It's like, well, prove I have a weapon. How can you prove it? You know, well, we think that's a weapon. Well, prove it, you know. And even if you do prove it, I don't know if that treaty has any penalties, you know, and especially this whole new space arena. I wonder if like Moon and Mars will be like Spain discovered the New World and claim they own the whole thing. And other countries say, oh, yeah, right. And Great Britain and Portugal and, you know, all these other countries started their own colonies and they would fight it out. And so it's almost might makes right ultimately. Who owns the moon? Who owns Mars? You know, if there's a good reason to own it. I mean, do countries want to risk political capital besides the financial to be on the moon? I mean, does it really matter? Is there anything really on the moon we care about? I remember in the 70s and 80s, you know, they're saying, well, why don't we have a military base on the moon? You know, and military says, well, I don't know. I can't think of a good reason why we'd have it there. You know, wars are on Earth. The moon's too far away. So for what that's worth.
Yeah, that is very true, sir. Okay, so Nari Shai has one more question. She asks, which countries do you think are dominating space war and technology presently?
Well, certainly the United States. And see, the trouble is too, is the United States has the most to lose. You've got a lot of satellites and you really depend on them for, you know, all these international conflicts we're doing, then you're the most vulnerable to it. If some countries just have a little bit up there, you know, you wonder, well, North Korea, Iran, you know, they have nukes, they have missiles. Put a nuke on a missile and blow it up and destroy a good part of our satellite systems. And do they care? Do they care what the rest of the world, you know, thinks about them? Do they care? They don't have any real satellites themselves, you know, and so there's kind of a difference in attitude versus countries, democracies versus absolutist kind of countries. Maybe the absolutist countries don't care about what people think, and they don't care about blowing things up and space junk and things like that. Though, you know, I hear rumors that the Chinese ASAT test, I don't know, 10 more years ago, created a lot of space junk, that the People's Liberation Army did it without telling the senior leadership. And they did it to show us it was a diplomatic thing. Again, the space being something showing resolve. They made sure the United States knew they were going to do it. And the United States sent people at the edges, so to speak. I think they might have sent them to Nepal and stuff like that with sensors to detect that attack and see it. And so, and then the U.S. a few months later had to shoot down its own satellites just to show, oh, we could do that, you know, with the ship launched thing. So it's all these like diplomatic things going on there. I'm sorry, what was the question again? I'm getting old, I forget.
No, sir. So, which is the dominating country?
Oh, which is dominating? Yeah, that's important. So certainly the United States, Russia used to be, but
Yeah.
then, you know, the country kind of crapped out, and then it's coming back. The perception is China, though. China is just going for it, and I knew years ago they were going for it, and I don't have the classified briefings now anymore. But just the fact that the Space Force came, you could see they're going for it. So it's probably an open question of either the Chinese, the Russian, who's ahead. I guess China's richer than Russia. So I think it'd be the United States, China, Russia. France has had a lot of military space systems. Matter of fact, they had their signals intelligence spacecraft that the United States publishes a catalog of space objects. And I think by treaty, they publish it for the United Nations. And they were publishing the French signal intelligence satellites, orbital elements, locations. And the French says, hey, stop doing that, or we'll start publishing your NRO spy satellite things, which, you know, don't end up in the catalog. They sort of do. They call it USA 123, but I bet you those aren't the real ones on there. Matter of fact, when I was in the Cheyenne Mountain Complex at NORAD, you know, the command center inside the mountain there in Colorado, at the Space Surveillance Center, they had little yellow stickies saying, don't track this satellite, this satellite, this satellite. I mean, they keep some things under wraps, so to speak. So the French seem very big on it. So I'd make them number 4. And then the Germans seem starting to be more and more. So they'd be number 5. Maybe the Italians have an interest in space. I have no indicators of space weapons. And then, you know, the Israelis are very silent, of course, on that whole thing. I bet you they got things they're just not talking about. Now, of course, I forgot about India. As far as a space power, India might be number 3 or 4 as far as number of satellites. I'd have to look at the statistics. And certainly, they're getting there in terms of space warfare. I mean, they did launch an anti-satellite system. For all I know, they've got all kinds of cyber weapons and jammers and things like that. I mean, the US has a counter communication system, and they'll freely tell you about that. Look it up online. It's down here in New Mexico, and it's for cyber warfare against satellites. So I see no reason why India wouldn't already have that. There's plenty of scientists in India who understand lasers. There's no reason why you can't have blinding lasers. I mean, you can have lasers that cut satellites in half, you know, on the ground. But the trouble is, you know, if it's cloudy, they're not usable. They're not mobile. You have to wait up to a month for a satellite to come over. If it doesn't come over, you can't attack it. So I don't think they're particularly useful. And, you know, the Space Command agreed with that at least years ago. So that's kind of my gut feel assessment of the level. And then you've got the X factors, you know, Iran, North Korea, who I'm sure have cyber weapons. I think they were jamming some of our GPS signals before Iran and all. And I'm sure they would very much like to attack some of our satellites, and they're probably working hard at that. I mean, Iran's launching some satellites now and again, but they're nowhere near a space power. I mean, I'm sure Italy has more satellites in orbit than Iran has.
So this is the last question that we have. What is the impact of the growing space war on the environment and climate crisis?
What was that again? Space war and climate?
Yeah, climate crisis and the environment and the impact that space war is going to have on that.
I can't think of any. I mean, you could say the space environment debris is bad, though it's not really like you see in the movies. I mean, physics-wise, if there's a bunch of debris in the same orbit as you, by definition, it means it's not coming and going. You know, it's not going to hit you. It's just there. It has to be in different orbits and things like that. So, environment and space, yes, you got to worry about the, you know, debris. But I just listed, there's all kinds of ways of attacking satellites that don't involve debris. Now, to back off on that, and oh, by the way, it's my impression that that's the preferred method. It seems like the in method. But to back off of that, I can give you a thought piece here. Think about a soldier in a trench, and these tanks are coming at him, or he knows tomorrow these tanks are going to come after him. And one of these tanks just squished his buddy yesterday. And a egghead guy comes up into the trench and this gives the soldier this black box with a big red button, and he says, push that button and the tank will stop, I assure you. However, you either get this black box with a red button or you get a bazooka, but you can't have both. Which do you want? And it seems to me the soldier is going to want the bazooka that gives a much more satisfying big flaming hole in the ground. And he knows the tank is gone. Where if he's got this black box and he pushes the red button and the tank stops, and then 30 seconds later it reboots and then it squishes him, you know, the moral of the story here is cyber weapons sound great. You know, it doesn't necessarily cause debris. It's clean. It's deniable. Oh, we didn't really do it. It's kind of hidden and things like that. But are you really sure it worked? Is the satellite playing dead? You know, does the country know you had this secret chip on there all along and they let it stay there just to make you feel good? And they have a way of getting around it. And people are just more clever than you think. And I think there's always this philosophy of, oh, we know everything and we're invulnerable and things like that. So getting back to the environment, one thing that bothers me, and the Air Force Research Lab here in Albuquerque is developing these space power generation, where you're out in space and you put these big solar panels out there and you can generate gigawatts of energy. Well, how do you get it to the ground? Well, you have this high energy beam going to the ground, you know, and it's like, well, how do you prevent, you know, airplanes from going into that beam? Are you heating up the atmosphere? You know, I don't know if that'd be big enough to make any sort of climate change things, but I've seen videos of high-powered lasers on the ground, and you know, during test modes, and I think it was a bat flew into it and went poof, you know. So that's the only thing I can tell. I don't know if space really affects the terrestrial environment, but I could be wrong.
Thank you so much, sir. And I want to first of all apologize for the disruptions that happened during the lecture. And
Kids will be kids.
yeah, I suppose, yes. So thank you so much once again for this lecture. I now call upon Evangeline to give the vote of thanks.
Hi, thank you, Zeba. So, all right. So I'm sure you will all agree when I say that it was a true honor to have Paul Szymanski speak for us today. His lucid arguments, his enthusiastic delivery, and his command of the topic, as well as the depth of his knowledge, were inspiring. Added to this, it was a genuine pleasure to have such an enthusiastic participation from the audience. I thank the president of AIRS, Ariba Ahsanat, for conceptualizing, realizing, and bringing to fruition our lecture. I would also like to thank Paul Szymanski for taking his time out of his busy schedule to join us and give us this enlightening, lecture. I thank all the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible, making special mention of Astha Benzani, Mohammed Fariz Uddin, Salma Jahan, and Tamkannat Ali. We at AIRS are grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination, and of the team, of the participants and the team at AIRS. Under the unfailing guidance of our President Ariba Muazzam, this event was made possible. Thank you so much, sir. It was such a pleasure to have you with us today.
It was fine. And, you know, if you want any more briefings, I'm available. And if you have anyone else in India who wants to see some of these briefings, I quite frankly have 20 or 30 different briefings on, you know, essentially how to conduct and win wars in outer space. And actually, I don't know if you've got any recommendations. I've got several papers I want to publish, and I was thinking it might be interesting to publish them in India, because it's obvious India is becoming more interested in this topic, and I wouldn't mind plugging myself into better into, who's in charge of such things there in India.
So we'll definitely get back to you on that with more details and about the journals and the publications. I'm sure Ariba knows a lot more about this, and she's the one interested in all of these things, so she's going to bring in more into the conversation that we can continue to have outside of the Zoom lecture. So thank you so much for coming here to speak with us, sir. And with this, I call this event to an end. Have a good day, good evening, and good morning. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Bye, sir. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.